Three armed men on her porch, a forged court order in the sheriff's hand, the man who murdered her father standing 1 foot away smiling, and the cowboy she loved was reaching for his rifle, ready to die for her in the next 10 seconds. So she did the one thing no one expected. She stepped forward, looked the smiling shadow from Boston dead in the eye, and said, "I will go with you." But what Ambrose Thackeray did not know was that the small folded note already hidden in her sleeve would destroy him before the week was out. To understand how a Boston lady ended up making the most dangerous bargain of her life on a Montana mountain porch, we have to go back to the day she first stepped down from that stagecoach in Promise Creek with nothing but a carpet bag, a folded letter, and a secret that would change three brothers' lives forever. The stagecoach groaned to a halt in a cloud of red Montana dust, and for a long moment nothing in Promise Creek moved. Not the horses at the hitching post, not the old men whittling on the porch of the dry goods store, not even the wind which had been carrying the scent of pine and approaching winter down from the Bitterroot Mountains all morning. A door creaked open. A small boot, polished once but now gray with the dust of 1,000 miles, touched the wooden platform. She stepped down slowly, carefully, as though the ground itself might betray her. Adelaide Marchwood was 22 years old, and she looked as out of place in this rough frontier town as a porcelain teacup set on a butcher block. Her honey blonde hair had been pinned in a modest knot at the back of her head when she left Boston 3 weeks ago. Now it hung loose around her shoulders in tired waves, the pins having surrendered somewhere between Chicago and the High Plains. Her navy blue traveling dress, once the pride of a Boston seamstress, was streaked with the dust of the territories. A small cameo brooch at her throat was the only thing about her that still looked like it belonged in the world she had come from. She clutched a single carpet bag in her left hand. In her right hand, pressed flat against her palm beneath her glove, was a folded piece of paper. A letter. The letter that had brought her 4,000 miles across a continent she had only seen in books. The old stagecoach driver, a wiry man named Gus, with tobacco stains in his beard, spat a stream of brown juice into the dust and looked her up and down with eyes that had seen too much country. "Boston," he said. It was not a question. Della nodded once. Gus shook his head slowly, the way a man shakes his head at a funeral. 40 miles, miss. 40 miles up that mountain road to the Hollander spread, and the sun is already past noon. You best find yourself a room at Stone's Inn and wait until morning. Nobody travels that pass after dark. Nobody who wants to come back anyway." Della lifted her chin. It was a small movement, but it was the movement of a woman who had run out of choices a long time ago. "Someone is supposed to meet me here," she said. Her voice was softer than she had intended. Her throat was dry from 3 days without proper water. Gus squinted at her. Then he glanced down the dusty main street, his weathered eyes sweeping the wooden facades of Promise Creek, as though looking for something he did not expect to find. "Well, miss," he said slowly, "I do not see anybody waiting on you. And the Hollander brothers are not the kind of men who keep folks waiting unless something has gone wrong." He paused. He spat again. "And on that mountain, miss, things go wrong all the time." Before we go any further into Della's story, before we climb that mountain pass with her and meet the three men who would change every single thing about her life, let me ask you something. If this is your first time here on the channel, hit that subscribe button below. Every week I bring you new stories from the frontier stories of love, forged in hardship and loyalty, earned through fire. And down in the comments, tell me where you are listening from tonight. I love hearing from every corner of this great country. Now lean back, pour yourself something warm, and let me take you back to that dusty platform in Promise Creek, where Adelaide Marchwood is about to discover that the man she traveled 4,000 miles to meet is not coming for her at all. To understand why Della Marchwood was standing alone in a Montana frontier town with nothing but a carpet bag and a folded letter, you have to go back 6 months. Back to a brick townhouse on Beacon Hill in Boston, where a young woman had once lived a life that anyone in Promise Creek would have called a fairy tale. Adelaide Marchwood had been born into comfort. Her father, Edmund Marchwood, was a shipping merchant of modest fortune and unbending principle. He owned 3 small vessels that ran the Atlantic coast hauling textiles and salted cod and whatever else the market demanded. He was not a wealthy man by Boston standards. He was not a Cabot or a Lodge. But he was honest, and in a city where honesty was a rarer commodity than gold, that honesty had earned him friends. Della's mother had died of fever when Della was 10 years old. Her father had never remarried. Instead, 2 years later, he had walked into the house one snowy December evening, carrying a small bundle wrapped in a horse blanket. Inside the bundle was a baby boy, no more than 3 days old, abandoned at the steps of St. Mary's Convent. Edmund Marchwood had named the boy Wren because the child had cried with the small, fierce sound of a winter wren defending its nest. He had raised Wren as his own son, and Della, who was 12 at the time, had become the only mother Wren would ever know. For 5 years, the 3 of them had been a family, imperfect, quiet, but a family. Then came Ambrose Thackeray. Della closed her eyes for a moment on the platform of Promise Creek, and she saw Thackeray's face the way she always saw it now. The silver hair combed back from his high forehead, the pale blue eyes that never quite smiled when his mouth did, the soft pink hands of a man who had never lifted anything heavier than a teacup. Ambrose Thackeray had been her father's business partner for 15 years. He had been a guest at their Sunday dinners. He had brought Della peppermint sticks when she was a little girl, and he had murdered her father as surely as if he had put a knife in his heart. It had begun with a shipment of crates that arrived at Boston Harbor in the spring of 1877, listed as bolts of English wool, but found by customs inspectors to contain repeating rifles bound for buyers Edmund Marchwood had never heard of. The papers all bore Edmund's signature, his seal, his handwriting. Della's father had stood in the customs office, white as a sheet, swearing he had never signed those papers, never seen those crates. Nobody believed him. Nobody except his daughter and a small boy who did not yet understand what arrest meant. The trial had been swift. The evidence had been overwhelming. The judge, a man named Horace Pemberton, who later turned out to have very large debts and very deep pockets, sentenced Edmund Marchwood to 10 years in the Charlestown State Prison. 3 months later, Edmund Marchwood was dead. The official cause was pneumonia. The unofficial cause, whispered to Della by a kind guard who had taken pity on her, was a cup of broth that had been delivered to her father's cell by a man nobody could later identify. 2 weeks after her father's funeral, Ambrose Thackeray had appeared at the Marchwood house with a folder of legal documents. He had bought up all of Edmund's debts. He had purchased the mortgages. He had quietly arranged through that same Judge Pemberton to be appointed legal guardian of one Wren Marchwood, age 5, an orphan, with no other surviving relatives of legal standing. Della had stood in the parlor of her childhood home and listened to Ambrose Thackeray explain in his soft, pleasant voice exactly what was going to happen next. She would be allowed to remain in the house. She would be allowed to continue caring for Wren. In exchange, she would understand that she now belonged to him, not as a wife. Wives had legal protections, something else, something he never quite named because men like Thackeray never had to name the things they took. That night, Della had taken Wren in her arms and run. She had run to the only place she could think of, the only place where Thackeray would not immediately look. St. Mary's Convent on the north side of Boston, the same convent where Wren had been left as a newborn 5 years before. Sister Hesper, the kind old nun who had first held Wren in his blanket, had hidden the 2 of them in the cellar for 7 days. On the 8th day, Sister Hesper had come down to the cellar with a newspaper and a determined look on her wrinkled face. "Child," she had said, "you cannot stay here. He will find you. He has men everywhere. There is one way I know to get you out of Boston far enough that even his money cannot reach you. But you will have to be brave, braver than you have ever been." She had handed Della the newspaper. It was open to a single page, the matrimonial column. "There are decent men out west, child. Hard men but decent, mountain men, ranchers, men who need wives and ask no questions. You will go first. You will write to me when you are settled. And when it is safe, I will bring Ren to you. I swear it on every prayer I have ever spoken. Della had read the column for 2 hours. She had read it through tears that blurred the small printed advertisements until they ran together like rain on a window. And then she had stopped on one. One advertisement no longer than 4 lines placed by a man in the Montana territory. I have no fortune. I have a mountain, a roof, and the word of a man. If you come, you will never have to be afraid again. Address replies to Cassius Hollander. Promise Creek, Montana territory. Della had written back that same night. For 6 months, she and Cassius Hollander had exchanged letters. Slow letters that took weeks to cross the continent. His handwriting was rough but careful, the writing of a man who had taught himself with great labor and even greater patience. He told her about the mountain, about the brothers he lived with, about the cabin his father had built with his own hands. He told her he was not a smooth talker. He told her he was 30 years old and had never been married because no woman had ever ridden up that mountain road and stayed. He never asked her about Boston. He never asked her why she was leaving. He simply said in his 4th letter that whatever she was running from, she would not have to run anymore when she crossed his threshold. Della had not told him about Wren. She had not told him about Ambrose Thackeray. She had not told him about the small leather notebook hidden in the false bottom of her carpet bag, the notebook her father had pressed into her hands the last time she had visited him in prison. The notebook that contained names and dates and bribes and signatures that could destroy half the men of Boston, including Ambrose Thackeray himself. She was afraid that if she told Cassius Hollander the truth, he would withdraw his offer, and then she would have nowhere left to run. Now she stood on the wooden platform of Promise Creek, far from the brick townhouse on Beacon Hill, and the man who had promised her safety was nowhere to be seen. Gus was looking at her with something like pity. He opened his mouth to say something else, perhaps to offer to take her back inside the stage office, when the sound came drifting up the street. Hoofbeats, a single horse moving fast. Della turned. Down the dusty length of Promise Creek's main street, Aratus was approaching. He sat the saddle the way a man sits a chair he has known all his life. Tall and lean, his coat dark with road dust, a wide-brimmed hat pulled low against the sun. As he came closer, Della saw that he was younger than she had expected, perhaps her own age. His face was the face of a boy who had been pushed into a man's body too soon, soft brown eyes that did not match the hardness of his jaw, a harmonica visible in the breast pocket of his shirt. The rider pulled up at the platform and dismounted in a single fluid motion. He removed his hat. His hair was chestnut brown, slightly curled, falling across his forehead. "Miss Marchwood," he said. His voice was soft and a little hoarse, as though he had been holding back tears for a long time. Della nodded. "I am Lyndon Hollander. Cassius is my brother. He sent me to bring you home." The word home hung in the dusty air between them like a small bell ringing. Della found herself unable to speak. Lyndon seemed to understand. He bent down, picked up her carpet bag with gentle hands, and carried it toward a small buckboard wagon hitched at the end of the platform. Della followed him, her boots clicking softly on the wooden planks. As Lyndon helped her up onto the wagon seat, she finally found her voice. "Why did your brother not come himself?" she asked. Lyndon paused. He held the reins in his hands but did not yet flick them. He stared straight ahead at the dusty street, at the distant blue line of the Bitterroot Mountains rising beyond Promise Creek, like a wall between her and everything she had left behind. "There was trouble at the ranch this morning, miss. A mountain wolf came down from the high country last night, killed 2 of our calves before sunrise. Cass and Rourke have been tracking it since dawn. Cass made me swear on our mother's grave that I would come for you and that you would arrive at the ranch safe." He flicked the reins. The buckboard rolled forward, leaving Promise Creek behind. For a long while, neither of them spoke. The town faded behind them. The road climbed gradually upward, winding between stands of pine and aspen. the autumn leaves trembling gold and red against the deep green of the evergreens. The air grew cooler. Della pulled her thin shawl tighter around her shoulders. It was Lyndon who broke the silence at last. His voice was quieter now, more uncertain. Miss Marchwood, there is something I need to tell you. Something my brother did not put in his letters because he was afraid you would not come. But you ought to know it before we get to the ranch. Della turned to look at him. The wagon creaked and swayed. A hawk circled high above the road. Our mother died 6 years ago, Lyndon said. Winter fever. There was nothing the doctor could do. She was the kindest woman I have ever known. After she died, our father stopped sleeping. He stopped eating. He stopped talking to us. 3 months after we buried her, he walked out to the horse barn one morning before any of us were awake, and he hanged himself from the rafters. Lyndon's voice did not break, but his hands tightened on the reins until the knuckles turned white. Cass found him. Cass was 24 years old. I was 16. Rourke was 21 and away on a cattle drive at the time. Cass cut our father down by himself. He covered our father's face with his own coat, and then he came inside and he made breakfast for me. And he never said one word about what he had seen in that barn. Not that morning, not ever. Della felt tears rising in her own eyes. She did not try to stop them. Since that day, no woman has set foot on the Hollander Ranch. Cass has not so much as walked into a saloon to look at one. He has been carrying all of us on his back for 6 years. Me, Rourke, the cattle, the mortgage, the memory of our parents, everything. And then 6 months ago, he started writing to you, and for the first time since I was a boy, I saw my brother smile. Just a little, just sometimes, when your letters arrived. Lyndon turned and looked at her, his soft brown eyes swimming. I am not telling you this to pressure you, miss. I am telling you because you deserve to know what kind of man you have agreed to marry. Cass is not a smooth man. He does not know how to make pretty speeches. But there is no better man on this mountain or any other, and he has been waiting for you. Della reached out slowly and placed her small gloved hand on Lyndon's wrist. He startled at the touch. Thank you, Lyndon, she said. Thank you for telling me. He nodded once and flicked the reins, and they rode on in a silence that was no longer empty. The road climbed higher. The pines grew taller. Twice they passed water crashing down from the rocks above, fed by snowmelt from the high peaks. Once Della saw a small herd of mule deer bound across the road and disappear into the timber. The sky overhead was the deep, aching blue of a Montana autumn, the kind of blue she had never seen in Boston, the kind of blue that made a person feel small and alive at the same time. After 3 hours of climbing, the road crested a ridge, and Lyndon pulled the buckboard to a stop. There it is, miss, he said softly. The Hollander Ranch. Della looked down into the valley below, and her breath caught in her throat. She had imagined a hovel, a rough lean-to of unpeeled logs, a muddy yard, perhaps a single skinny cow. That was what her Boston imagination had built when she had read the words mountain homestead. But what she saw now was not that at all. A wide green valley opened beneath them, cradled on 3 sides by the sheer dark walls of the Bitterroot Mountains. A creek wound through the valley like a silver ribbon, catching the late afternoon sun in flashes of light. At the heart of the valley stood a large 2-story log house, its walls golden with sun, its windows reflecting the sky. Smoke rose from a stone chimney in a thin white column. Beyond the house stood a long horse barn, a cattle barn, a smokehouse, and a small kitchen garden, going gently to sleep for the winter. Beyond the barns, a herd of cattle grazed peacefully on the autumn grass. And rising beyond all of it, the Bitterroots, their highest peaks already wearing, the first dusting of snow, stood like silent guardians. It was not a hovel, it was a kingdom. A small, hard-won, beautiful kingdom in the middle of nowhere. Tears rolled down Della's cheeks before she even knew she was crying. Lyndon looked at her alarmed. Miss, are you well? It is beautiful, she whispered. Lyndon, it is so beautiful. I did not know. He smiled then, a small private smile. Cass built half of it himself, miss. The new wing of the house, the smokehouse, the fence around the kitchen garden. He says a man should leave more behind him than he found. He says that all the time. The buckboard began its slow descent into the valley. As they came nearer the ranch, Della saw two figures standing near the horse barn. Two tall men, broad-shouldered in dark coats and wide-brimmed hats. One of them held the bridle of a tall bay horse. The other had a rifle slung across his back. Both of them turned at the sound of the approaching wagon. Della's heart began to pound. Hard. Harder than it had pounded on the train. Harder than it had pounded when she fled Boston. Harder than it had pounded when Ambrose Thackeray had stood in her parlor and explained what he intended to do with her. She saw him then. She saw Cassius Hollander for the first time. He stood at the entrance to the horse barn with the late sunlight falling across his face. He was taller than she had imagined, perhaps 6'4". His shoulders were broad enough to fill a doorway. His coat was dark leather, scuffed and stained from the morning's hunt. The handle of a long knife protruded from his belt. His chestnut hair was cut shorter than his brother's, and his face was clean-shaven except for 2 days of stubble along his strong jaw. A small white scar cut through his left eyebrow. But it was his eyes that stopped her breath. They were the color of whiskey held up to the firelight. Steady eyes, patient eyes, eyes that had seen a great deal and forgiven most of it. He looked at her, and for a long moment neither of them moved. Lyndon pulled the wagon to a stop. He climbed down without a word and led the horses away toward the barn, leaving his brother and the woman from Boston alone in the long golden light of a Montana autumn afternoon. Cass walked toward the wagon slowly, as though he were afraid he might frighten her. He stopped beside the wagon seat and looked up at her, and she saw that his hands, which were the largest hands she had ever seen, were trembling slightly. He removed his hat. His voice when he spoke was deep and a little rough, the voice of a man who did not use his words often and did not waste them when he did. "Miss Marchwood," he said. "Yes," she whispered. He reached up. His huge, calloused hand offered itself to her palm up. Della placed her small, gloved hand into it. His fingers closed around hers, gentle as a man closing his hand around a sparrow. He helped her down from the wagon. Her boots touched the soft earth of the Hollander ranch. She looked up into his whiskey-colored eyes, and she saw the tremor in them, the same tremor that she felt in her own throat. "You are home now, Della," he said. It was the first time anyone had called her by her first name in 6 months. It was the first time in 2 years that she had heard the word home spoken to her with meaning. She did not answer. She did not need to. The tears that rolled down her cheeks said everything that words could not. The third Hollander brother appeared then from the corner of the horse barn. Rourke Hollander, 27 years old. The middle brother, the one Lyndon had warned her about in his letters with the words, "My brother is the kindest soul on this mountain, but he was born with a gun in his hand." Rourke was as tall as Cass and built with the same broad frame, but where Cass moved with quiet steadiness, Rourke moved with the loose, easy grace of a man who could draw a pistol faster than most men could think about it. He wore 2 revolvers low on his hips, navy bandana knotted at his throat. His hair was a little longer than his brother's, and he had the kind of half-smile that told a person he was always on the edge of either a joke or a fight. He took one look at Della standing beside Cass and let out a low whistle. "Well, Brother Rourke," said, his eyes warm with mischief. "The Boston lady is even prettier than her letters made her sound. You must have prayed extra hard." Cass shot his brother a look that would have stopped a charging bull. Rourke only grinned wider. "Welcome to the Hollander Ranch, Miss Marchwood." "I am Rourke, the handsome one. Whatever Cass has told you about me is mostly lies. Whatever Lyndon has told you is probably true." Della felt herself smile for the first time in months. A real smile, a smile that surprised her. Cass cleared his throat. "Come inside," he said. "You have had a long journey. Lyndon has supper started." He carried her carpet bag in one hand as easily as if it were empty. With his other hand, he gestured for her to walk beside him toward the great log house. The door of the Hollander house stood open. Warm yellow light spilled out into the cooling autumn air. The smell of wood smoke and something rich and savory, perhaps a venison stew, drifted out to meet her. Della stepped across the threshold of the place she had traveled 4,000 miles to find. The interior of the house was larger and warmer than Della had imagined. The main room was a great open space with a stone fireplace at one end big enough to walk into with a cheerful fire crackling on the hearth. The floors were wide pine planks worn smooth by years of boot heels. A long, heavy table of dark oak stood in the center of the room, set for four with mismatched but carefully polished tin plates. Above the mantel hung a long Hawken rifle and a faded daguerreotype of a man and a woman in their wedding clothes the parents Lyndon had spoken of. A bearskin rug lay in front of the fire. Two rocking chairs sat to either side of the hearth. The walls were hung with cured hides, coiled rope oil lamps, and a single small frame sampler that read, "God bless this house," in faded blue thread, stitched, Della would later learn, by the hand of a mother who had been dead for 6 years. It was a man's house. It was a working house. But underneath the rough and ready surface, Della could see traces of a woman who had loved this place once. The careful arrangement of the dried herbs hanging from the kitchen rafters, the small earthenware pitcher with the chipped lip standing on a windowsill, the way the rocking chairs were angled toward each other as though waiting for two people to sit down and resume an old conversation. Cass set her carpet bag down by the foot of the stairs. "Your room is up there," he said quietly. "Top of the stairs, last door on the right. It used to be my mother's sewing room. I painted it last week." Lyndon picked the curtains. Rourke put fresh wildflowers on the bedside table this morning. He pretends he is too rough for that kind of thing, but he is not. Della looked at him. She did not know what to say. Cass cleared his throat again. He turned his hat in his hands. "Miss Marchwood. Della, I want to say something to you. I want to say it now. On your first night, so there is no confusion between us." The other two brothers had quietly stopped what they were doing in the kitchen area. Lyndon was holding a wooden spoon over a pot of stew. Rourke was leaning against the door frame with his arms crossed. Both of them were watching their older brother with something close to reverence. "You came here as my promised wife," Cass said. His voice was steady but very quiet. "I will not deny that. We have written letters back and forth for 6 months, and I have come to feel that I know something of who you are. But agreeing to come is not the same as agreeing to stay. I will not have a wife who is here because she has nowhere else to go." He paused. He looked at her with those steady, whiskey-colored eyes. "Tonight and every night until you say otherwise, you will sleep in that room upstairs. Alone, the door has a lock. Use it if it makes you feel safer. I will sleep out in the horse barn loft. Rourke and Lyndon have their own rooms down the hall, but you do not need to worry about them. They are good men. I raised them to be good men. You have 30 days to decide if you wish to stay. 30 days to look at this ranch and at me and at this life and to decide whether this is what you want. If at the end of those 30 days you wish to return to Boston, I will personally drive you back to Promise Creek. I will pay for your stagecoach fare and your train fare all the way back to your front door, and I will not ask you a single question about why. A Hollander keeps his word." Della felt her eyes burning. She could not remember the last time a man had offered her a choice, any choice, about anything. Rourke broke the silence in his typical way. "Big brother," he drawled, "that is the most words I have heard you string together since the spring of '76. I think the lady has stopped breathing." "Hush," Rourke said Lyndon quietly. Della took a slow breath. She looked at the three brothers standing in their warm log house in the middle of the Montana wilderness, and she felt something she had not felt in a very long time. It was not love. It was too soon for love. But it was the seed of love. It was the first faint possibility of a future that did not end in fear. "Thank you, Mr. Hollander," she said. Her voice was steadier than she expected. "Your terms are more than fair. They are kind. I do not have many words tonight. I am very tired. But I will say this, I am grateful to be here." Cass nodded once. His shoulders, which had been tight as bowstrings, relaxed almost imperceptibly. "Supper," said Lyndon. They sat down at the long oak table. Lyndon ladled venison stew into the 4 tin plates. Rourke produced a loaf of crusty cornbread that he had baked himself that morning, a fact he announced with great pride, and which his brothers immediately mocked. Cass poured Della a tin cup of coffee, dark and strong. For the next hour, the four of them ate together. Rourke told stories, most of them outrageous lies designed to make Della laugh. Lyndon corrected him gently. Cass said almost nothing, but he watched Della from the head of the table with a quiet attention that made her feel for the first time in 2 years that she was being seen rather than measured. She laughed twice during that meal. The first time, the sound surprised her so much that she pressed her fingers to her mouth. The second time, she let it come out unguarded. Cass looked at her when she laughed. He did not smile, but something in his eyes brightened, and Della understood that this man's joy was a quiet thing kept inside, only visible to those who knew where to look. After supper, Lyndon insisted on washing the dishes. Rourke went out to check on the horses one last time before nightfall. Cass walked Della to the foot of the stairs. "Good night, Della," he said. "Good night, Cass." He hesitated. Then he added very softly, "The mountain is quiet at night. You will hear owls. You will hear coyotes a long way off. Nothing on this mountain will hurt you. Not while I am breathing." She climbed the stairs alone. At the top, the last door on the right stood ajar. She pushed it open. The room was small but immaculate. A narrow bed covered with a quilt of red and blue calico squares, a small chest of drawers, a wash basin and a pitcher on a stand, a kerosene lamp burning on the bedside table. Beside the lamp, in a chipped pottery cup, a small bouquet of late wildflowers, asters and goldenrod, and a single sprig of mountain sage. Rourke's wildflowers. Della touched one of the petals and felt fresh tears rise. She set her carpet bag on the bed. She sat down beside it. For a long moment, she simply listened to the quiet of the house settling around her, the fire popping downstairs, the murmur of the brothers' voices, the wind moving softly through the pines outside her small window. Then slowly, she reached into her carpet bag. She lifted out her folded dresses, her hairbrush, her mother's small leather Bible. And from the very bottom, hidden inside a false compartment that her father had built into the bag's lining the last summer of his life, she withdrew a small leather notebook. The notebook was no bigger than her hand. Its cover was scarred and stained. Its pages were filled with her father's careful handwriting. Names, dates, numbers, bribes paid and bribes received. The names of judges, customs officials, dock foremen, and one name that appeared on page after page, the name that had become the architecture of her nightmares: Ambrose Thackeray. Della held the notebook in her trembling hands and stared at it. This was her weapon. This was the only thing she had taken from Boston that mattered. If anyone in this house found it, she did not yet know what they would do. They might believe her. They might not. They might decide she was too much trouble and put her back on the next stage to Promise Creek. She slid the notebook beneath her mother's Bible and tucked both items into the bottom drawer of the small chest. She closed the drawer slowly. Tomorrow, she thought, tomorrow she would think about how to hide it better. Tomorrow she would think about how to get word back to Sister Hesper that she had arrived safely. Tomorrow she would think about how to find Wren and bring him here to this beautiful valley before Ambrose Thackeray could do whatever he was planning to do. Tomorrow. Tonight she undressed slowly in the lamplight, washed her face in the basin of cold mountain water, and slipped into the narrow bed beneath the calico quilt. The mattress was filled with sweet-smelling prairie hay. The pillow was stuffed with goose down. She had not slept on a real bed in 9 days. Her last thought before sleep took her was of 3 pairs of whiskey-colored eyes watching her across a long oak table, and of a deep, quiet voice saying, "You are home now, Della." And she fell asleep smiling for the first time in 2 years. Down in the horse barn in the loft above the stalls, Cassius Hollander did not sleep. He sat with his back against a stack of hay bales and held in his rough hands a folded yellowed letter. The letter was the last thing his father had ever written. Cass had read it perhaps 1,000 times in the 6 years since he had cut his father down from the rafters of this very barn. Most of the letter was a goodbye. Most of it was the broken apology of a man who could not carry his grief any longer. But there was one line near the end that Cass had never been able to forget. One line that he reread now in the soft light of a single lantern. Cassius, my eldest, listen to me. There is a man named Ambrose Thackeray who took everything from this family in the cattle drive of '72. He swindled me. He left me drowning in debt I could not pay. He is the reason this ranch is in danger. If he ever finds his way into your life or the lives of your brothers, you must run. Or if you cannot run, you must put him in the ground before he puts you in it. He is not a man. He is a smiling shadow in fine clothes, and shadows like him eat good men whole. Cass folded the letter slowly. He stared up at the dark wooden rafters of the barn, the same rafters his father had used to end his own life. He did not yet know that the woman now sleeping in his mother's old sewing room had carried 4,000 miles across a continent a small leather notebook with the name Ambrose Thackeray written on every other page. He did not yet know that fate had brought into his house the only person in the world who shared his particular hatred of the smiling shadow from Boston. He did not yet know that within the next 2 weeks, a letter would arrive at the Hollander Ranch with a Boston postmark, and that letter would change everything. He only knew as he sat alone in the loft that night that something in his chest had been broken open by the sight of Della Marchwood stepping down from that buckboard. Something he had walled off 6 years ago after he had carried his father's body inside and laid it on the kitchen table and made breakfast for his weeping younger brother. Something that he had not believed could ever open again. He whispered into the dark of the barn the words he had not said to anyone in 6 years, not even to himself. Please, Lord, let her stay. Outside, a coyote called from somewhere up on the high ridge. The wind moved through the pines. The first stars of the Montana night came out one by one above the dark walls of the Bitterroot Mountains. And in the small room at the top of the stairs, Adelaide Marchwood slept beneath a calico quilt, dreaming for the first time in 2 years of something other than fear. She dreamed of a green valley. She dreamed of a quiet voice. She dreamed of 3 pairs of whiskey-colored eyes. And in her dream, she heard a small boy laughing somewhere in the distance, and she knew with the certainty of all dreams that the boy was her brother Wren, and that he was running through wildflowers, and that he was free. She did not yet know that Ambrose Thackeray had already begun to move. She did not yet know that a man in a black bowler hat was at this very moment boarding a westbound train out of Boston with her photograph in his pocket and a Pinkerton badge pinned beneath his coat. She did not yet know that the first snow of the Montana winter was less than 2 weeks away, and that with it would come a storm that would trap her inside this house with 3 strange men for 5 days and 5 nights of storm that would either make her or break her. She did not yet know that the man sleeping in the horse barn below her had been waiting his entire life for a woman to walk through that valley pass, and that he had no idea whatsoever how to tell her so. She only slept, deeply, peacefully, for the first time in 2 years. Outside, the wind in the pines whispered an old promise older than any of them. Winter always ends. Winter always ends. Winter always ends. And on the mountain, in the loft of the barn, Cassius Hollander finally lowered his head onto a saddle blanket and let himself believe just a little that this winter might end differently from all the ones that had come before. The first week passed like a dream Della was afraid to wake from. She rose before dawn each morning, the way her mother had taught her long ago in the brick townhouse on Beacon Hill, and she padded down the wooden stairs in her stocking feet to find the great main room of the Hollander house already warm. Cass had been up since 4. He had built the fire in the stone hearth before sunrise, set a kettle of water to boil for coffee, and laid out fresh kindling for the cook stove. He never spoke much in those early hours. He simply tipped his hat to her as she came down the stairs, poured her a tin cup of strong black coffee, and went out into the cold blue dawn to feed the horses. By her second morning at the ranch, Della was determined to make herself useful. She tied her honey blonde hair back with a strip of blue ribbon. She rolled up the sleeves of one of the simple gray cotton dresses she had brought from Boston, and she walked into the kitchen and announced to Lyndon that she was going to make breakfast. Lyndon looked up from the wood box with surprise written across his soft features. "Miss, you do not have to do that." "We do not expect I want to," she said quietly. "Please, show me where everything is." He showed her. The flour bin, the lard tin, the cast iron skillet hung on its nail above the stove, the crock of fresh eggs gathered the night before from the small hen house behind the cabin, the strips of bacon hanging in the smokehouse. By the time the sun had climbed above the Bitterroot Peaks, Della had laid out a breakfast of fried eggs, thick bacon biscuits made from her grandmother's old recipe, and a pot of coffee strong enough to wake the dead. Cass came in from the cold with frost in his eyebrows. He stopped just inside the door. He stared at the laden table for a long moment without moving. Then he removed his hat slowly as a man removes his hat in church. "Della, you did all this I wanted to," she said. "I am tired of being a guest." Cass crossed the room. He sat down at the head of the long oak table. He bowed his head and said grace in a voice so quiet that only Della could hear it. When he raised his head, his whiskey-colored eyes were wet at the corners. "This is the first hot breakfast a woman has cooked in this house in 6 years," he said. Della had to look away because she did not want him to see her cry. By the third day, she had a routine. She rose with Cass. She made breakfast. She washed the dishes while Lyndon swept the floors and Rourke went out to chop wood. She helped Lyndon prepare the noon meal. In the afternoon, she walked out into the sunshine and learned the names of things. The big bay gelding was Thunder. The little gray mare was Pearl. The old yellow ranch dog, who had taken to following Della everywhere, was named Mr. Briggs after the storekeeper down in Promise Creek, who had given him to Cass as a puppy. On the fourth day, Rourke decided it was time for the Boston lady to learn how to shoot. He marched her out behind the horse barn with 2 of his battered tin cans and a single-action revolver in his hand. He set the cans up on a fence post 20 paces away. He turned to her with that crooked half-smile of his. "Boston lady, on this mountain, a woman has to know how to defend herself. Wolves, mountain lions, drifters who do not know better. I'm going to show you how to handle a pistol, and I am going to keep showing you until you can hit what you aim at. Do you understand me?" Della took the revolver from his hand. It was heavier than she had expected. The walnut grip was warm where Rourke had been holding it. She turned it over carefully, checking the cylinder the way she had once watched her father check the small Derringer he had carried in his coat pocket on dark nights in Boston. Rourke's eyebrows went up. "You have held a gun before, a little," she said quietly. "My father taught me when I was 12. She raised the revolver. She steadied her right hand with her left. She breathed out slowly the way her father had taught her. She squeezed the trigger. The first tin can flew off the fence post in a clean spinning arc. Rourke stared. He took off his hat. He scratched the back of his head. He put his hat back on. "Boston lady," he said slowly, "I think you and I are going to be just fine." She fired 5 more shots. She hit 4 of the 5 cans. By the time the last can flipped end over end into the autumn grass, Cass and Lyndon had both come out of the barn to see what the shooting was about. Cass leaned against the corner of the building and watched Della reload the revolver with the calm, methodical hands of a woman who had done this many times before. He did not say anything, but the corner of his mouth lifted just slightly, and Della, glancing at him, caught the small, private smile and felt a warmth bloom in her chest that had nothing to do with the kick of the revolver. That evening after supper, Lyndon asked her if she could read. Della laughed. "Yes, Lyndon, I can read." His soft brown eyes lit up like a boy on Christmas morning. He disappeared into a small bedroom at the back of the house and returned a moment later with his arms full of books. worn leather-bound volumes, a complete Shakespeare, a copy of A Christmas Carol with the spine cracked from many readings, a small, tattered book of Walt Whitman poems, a King James Bible bigger than his head. He set them all down on the long oak table with great reverence. "I can read, miss," he said, "but I read slow. I want to hear how the words sound when somebody who knows how to read reads them out loud." Della reached for the Dickens. She opened it to the first page. Marley was dead to begin with. She read for an hour by the firelight. Cass settled himself into one of the rocking chairs by the hearth and listened with his eyes closed and his big calloused hands folded in his lap. Rourke sprawled on the bearskin rug and watched the flames. Lyndon sat at the table with his chin in his hands and listened the way a starving man listens to the sound of supper being ladled into a bowl. And outside, the wind began to stir in the pines, and the temperature began to drop. And somewhere far above the valley, the first thin clouds of a coming storm began to gather above the Bitterroot peaks. None of them noticed. The next morning, Cass took Della walking along the creek that wound through the valley. He showed her the wild plants that grew along the bank. The poison hemlock she must never touch. The white sage that the old trappers used to flavor their stews. The yarrow that could stop bleeding if a person was ever cut far from a doctor. He spoke quietly as they walked, his deep voice naming each plant with the patient certainty of a man who had learned the mountain by living on it for 30 years. Della listened with all of her attention. She felt walking beside this huge, gentle man through the autumn light that she was being given a gift she could not yet name. Halfway along the creek, she slipped on a wet stone. Cass caught her hair in one motion. His big hand closed around her elbow and steadied her against his chest. For a single suspended moment, she was pressed against him, her cheek inches from the rough wool of his coat, his arm around her waist. She could feel his heart beating beneath his ribs, slow and strong. She raised her face. He looked down at her. Neither of them moved. It was Cass who broke the moment. He set her gently back on her feet and stepped away. His face had gone red beneath the weathered tan of his cheeks. He cleared his throat and looked at the creek as though it had personally offended him. "Careful, Miss Marchwood. The stones get slick this time of year." She nodded. She did not trust her voice. But as they walked back toward the house in the late afternoon light, Della realized she had been smiling for the past mile without knowing it. That evening, Lyndon rode down to Promise Creek to collect the weekly mail. He came back at sundown with a single envelope in his hand. It was addressed in a sharp, slanting copper plate hand to Miss Adelaide Marchwood in care of the Hollander Ranch, Promise Creek, Montana territory. The postmark was Boston. The wax seal on the back bore a small embossed letter T. Della took the letter from Lyndon's hand with fingers that had gone suddenly cold. She did not open it in front of the brothers. She climbed the stairs to her small room. She closed the door. She broke the seal. Inside was a single sheet of cream-colored paper. The handwriting was the same handwriting she had seen on 1,000 business documents in her father's study. "My dear Miss Marchwood, I trust this letter finds you well in your new home in the territories. You will be pleased to know that I have made it my personal business to discover where you have run to. Sister Hesper of St. Mary's Convent was, I am sorry to say, somewhat reluctant to share the information I required. But reluctance is a temporary condition when one knows how to ask the right questions. Your brother Wren is in my care, as is his legal right under the guardianship papers I hold. He is presently well. Whether he remains well is of course dependent upon your cooperation. I have two simple requests. First, I require the small leather notebook your late father pressed into your hands during your final visit to him at the Charlestown prison. You know the one I mean. Do not pretend otherwise. Second, I require your return to Boston within 60 days of the date of this letter. You will travel willingly. You will sign the documents I place before you. You will resume the position in my household that we discussed before your unfortunate departure. If you fail in either of these requirements, I cannot guarantee your brother's continued health. The men in my employ are not sentimental about children. One last word of warning, my dear. Do not place any trust in the Hollander brothers. You would be very surprised to learn what kind of family they truly come from. I have done my research. I always do my research. I look forward to seeing you again very soon. Your devoted guardian, Ambrose Thackeray. Della read the letter twice, then a third time. The room around her seemed to tilt and recede as though she were looking at it down the wrong end of a telescope. Sister Hesper, the kind old nun who had hidden them in the convent cellar. Reluctance is a temporary condition when one knows how to ask the right questions. Della pressed her fist to her mouth to keep from making a sound. Wren, her little brother, 5 years old, in the hands of Ambrose Thackeray, 60 days. She slid down the wall of the small room until she was sitting on the floor. She did not cry. The fear was too large for crying. She sat very still and stared at the patch of moonlight on the wide pine boards and tried to make her mind work. She could not give Thackeray the notebook. The notebook was the only thing in this world that could destroy him. The moment she handed it over, she and Wren and anyone who knew them would be dead within a week. She could not return to Boston. She would never reach Wren if she returned to Boston. Thackeray would hold her prisoner in his house and bleed her of every last shred of dignity until there was nothing left. She had to find another way, and she had to find it within 60 days, or her little brother would die. She also had two other thoughts that pressed themselves on her like cold hands. The first was that she could not face this alone. The second, and this one was hard, was that she did not yet know whether she could trust the three men sleeping in this house. Thackeray's last warning whispered at her from the page. Do not place any trust in the Hollander brothers. You would be very surprised to learn what kind of family they truly come from. It was almost certainly a lie. Thackeray was a master of lies. But what if it was not? Della folded the letter slowly and slid it beneath her mother's Bible in the bottom drawer of the chest. She undressed mechanically. She climbed into the narrow bed beneath the calico quilt. She did not sleep. Outside her small window, very far above the valley, the first thin snowflakes of the Montana winter began to fall. The storm came down out of the high country on the morning of her 10th day at the ranch. It came without warning. 1 hour, the sky above the valley was a hard, cold blue. The next hour, a wall of gray cloud rolled over the western peaks of the Bitterroot, and the wind began to scream down out of the passes like a living thing, and the temperature dropped 20 degrees in 20 minutes. Cass came stamping into the kitchen with snow already crusted in his beard. Blizzard, he said shortly. Big one. Coming fast. He gave orders the way that captain gives orders on a sinking ship. Calm, clear, no wasted breath. Rourke would help him drive the cattle into the sheltered side of the lower pasture. Lyndon would haul firewood from the woodshed into the house enough for a week. Della would fill every kettle and bucket and basin in the kitchen with water from the well, because once the storm hit, they would not be able to walk to the well without a rope tied around their waists. She did not argue. She put on Cass's spare wool coat, the one that hung to her knees, and made her look like a child playing dress-up, and she ran out into the rising wind to draw water. By noon, the snow was falling so thickly that she could not see the horse barn from the kitchen window. By 2 o'clock, the wind was a continuous howl that made the timbers of the great log house creak and complain. By dusk, the world outside had become a single blank wall of white. Cass and Rourke staggered in from the cattle pasture, covered in ice from collar to boot, their faces purple with cold. Lyndon helped them out of their coats and fed them hot coffee in front of the fire. Della draped wool blankets over their shoulders. None of them spoke for almost an hour. When Cass finally found his voice, it was scraped and raw. The cattle are in. The horses are in. Anything we did not bring inside it is going to die out there. We are not going outside again until this storm breaks. How long? Della asked. Cass looked at her with his weathered eyes. Could be 3 days. Could be 5. Could be a week. The mountain decides. That night, the four of them slept in the main room around the great stone hearth. Cass insisted that Della take the bearskin rug closest to the fire. He stationed himself on a hard wooden chair near the door, with his rifle across his knees. Lyndon curled up in one of the rocking chairs. Rourke stretched out on the floor with a saddle for a pillow. The wind shrieked outside. The flames leaped and danced. Della lay awake for a long time, staring at the firelight on the rough-hewn ceiling beams and listening to the slow, steady breathing of three men she had known for 10 days and was now bound to by a wall of snow. When she finally closed her eyes, she dreamed that Wren was calling her name from somewhere very far away and that she could not find him in the snow. Day one of the storm was very long. Rourke broke out an old wooden chess set that had belonged to his father. He set it up on the long oak table and looked at Della with a wicked grin. "Boston lady, I will go easy on you." Della did not need him to go easy on her. Her father had taught her to play chess in the long winter evenings of her childhood. By the second game, she had Rourke's king cornered against his own queen, and Rourke was staring at the board with the bewildered expression of a man who has just been hit on the head by a falling icicle. How he said, "How are you doing this? You are a Boston lady. You are supposed to embroider handkerchiefs." She let the smile come, and it felt like sunlight cracking through a winter sky. "My father taught me. He used to say that any fool could fight with a sword, but it took a real mind to fight with a board and 16 wooden pieces." She paused. She had not spoken about her father out loud in 2 years. "He was the kindest man I ever knew," she said softly. Cass looked up from the leather harness he was repairing in the corner. He did not say anything, but Della felt his attention settle on her like a warm blanket, and she understood that he had heard the catch in her voice and was filing it away the way he filed away every small thing about her. Day two of the storm, Lyndon brought out his harmonica. He sat on the hearth with his back against the warm stones and played the old tune Shenandoah. The notes drifted up into the rafters of the great log house and twined themselves around the howling of the wind outside until the wind itself seemed to soften. Rourke joined in, humming the harmony in a low, rough baritone that surprised Della. Cass kept the rhythm with his boot heel against the floor. And Della, sitting in one of the rocking chairs by the fire, felt the tears begin to slide down her cheeks before she even knew they were coming. This was the song her mother had sung to her at bedtime when she was a little girl in Boston. Her mother had sung it the night before she died. Della had not heard it played by another human being in 12 years. Lyndon looked up. He saw her tears. His soft brown eyes filled with concern, and his fingers paused above the harmonica. "This was my mother's song," Della whispered. "Please, please keep playing." Lyndon played it through to the end. Then he played it again. And then he slid into another old tune, Bonnie Blue Flag, and Rourke sang along, and Della closed her eyes and let the music wash over her. And for the first time in 2 years, she did not feel that she was alone in the world. Day three of the storm brought a crisis. A young calf in the cattle barn had gone weak with the cold. Cass and Rourke roped themselves together with 20 feet of stout hemp and went out into the white roaring wall of the storm to find it. Della watched from the window with her heart in her throat. Lyndon stood beside her and gripped the windowsill with both hands. The minutes stretched. 5 minutes, 10, 15, 20. When the door finally burst open, Cass stumbled in carrying the limp little body of a brown calf in his arms. The calf was barely breathing. Its small black eyes were glazed. Hot water Cass barked through cracked blue lips. Blankets. The fire. Della was already moving. She had a wool blanket spread on the bearskin rug before Cass had crossed the room. She filled a basin with hot water from the kettle. She tore strips from one of her own petticoats to use as cloths. Cass laid the calf gently in front of the hearth, and together they began the slow, patient work of bringing it back from the edge of death. Della soaked the cloths in the hot water and pressed them against the calf's cold body. Cass massaged its small chest with his huge calloused hands. Their fingers brushed a dozen times in that hour. Neither of them pulled away. The calf shuddered once. Then it took a small, wet breath. Then another. After half an hour, it lifted its little head and gave a feeble bleat. Cass let out a long, slow breath. He turned his head and looked at Della, and his whiskey-colored eyes were shining with something Della had not seen in any man's eyes since her father had been alive. "You have healing hands, Della Marchwood," he said. "That is a gift not many people are born with." Della looked down at the small calf. She did not trust her voice. She placed her hand over Cass's hand on the calf's warm flank, and they sat there together by the firelight for a long time, without speaking, while outside the wind continued its endless song. Day 4 of the storm, late evening, Rourke and Dwayden had both fallen asleep. Lyndon in his rocking chair, his harmonica still loosely held in one hand. Rourke stretched out on the bearskin rug with his hat pulled over his face. The fire had burned down to a steady bed of red coals. Della and Cass were the only two still awake. Della was sitting on the hearth wrapped in a wool blanket. Cass was in the rocking chair across from her, slowly turning his coffee cup in his big hands. The wind outside had died down a little. The storm was tiring at last. For a long time, neither of them spoke. Then Cass said very quietly, "I want to tell you something I have not told anybody." Della raised her eyes to his. "When my father killed himself, he said I was the one who found him. I walked out to the horse barn at sunrise to feed the stock, and there he was hanging from the highest crossbeam. I cut him down by myself. I covered his face with my own coat. I carried him into the kitchen and laid him on this table, the same table we eat breakfast on every morning. And then I walked into Lyndon's room and woke him up and told him our father was dead. Lyndon was 16 years old. He cried for 2 days. He could not stop. I made him soup. I made him tea. I read to him from the Bible. I never told him the truth about how I found our father. I told him our father had had a heart attack." Cass paused. He stared into the coals. Rourke was on a cattle drive in Wyoming. By the time the news reached him and he rode home, we had already buried our father next to our mother on the south slope of the valley. Rourke never asked how it happened. I think he knew. I think he always knew. We have never spoken of it. Not in 6 years. He is the only one besides me who knows the truth, and we have never said the words out loud. He looked up. His whiskey-colored eyes met hers across the firelight. "I have not told this to a single living soul in 6 years, Della. I do not know why I am telling you tonight. Maybe because the storm is making me weak. Maybe because I have been carrying it alone too long. Maybe because you are the first person who has ever sat in my house and looked at me as if I am a man and not just a man with a load on his back." Della did not say anything. She did not try to find words. She slid off the hearth and crossed the small space between them and knelt down on the wooden floor in front of his rocking chair. She took his huge, calloused hand in both of her small hands. She held it against her cheek. He let her. He did not pull away. A single tear slid down the weathered side of his face and disappeared into the stubble of his jaw. They stayed like that for a long time. The fire crackled. The wind sighed. Lyndon murmured in his sleep. Rourke shifted on the bearskin rug. Cass said very softly, "On this mountain, no one stands alone." Della closed her eyes. "I know," she whispered, "I know. Day 5 of the storm, the wind died at dawn." When Della opened her eyes, the great log house was utterly silent for the first time in 5 days. She lay still on the bearskin rug for a moment, listening to the absence of the wind. Then she sat up. She rose. She walked to the window and pushed open the heavy wooden shutters. The world outside was a country made of light. The valley lay buried under 3 feet of perfect, untouched snow. Every fence post wore a soft white cap. Every pine bough was loaded with crystals that glittered in the rising sun. The Bitterroot Mountains rose in the distance like a row of cathedrals, their peaks blazing pink and gold in the dawn. The air was so clear it almost hurt to breathe. Della stepped out onto the front porch wrapped in the wool blanket. The cold was sharp, but no longer cruel. The storm had passed. A moment later, Cass came out and stood beside her. He did not touch her. He simply stood there, his huge frame at her shoulder, looking out across the valley he had built and saved and held together for 6 years alone. "Winter always ends, Della Marchwood," he said quietly. She turned to look up at him. She was no longer the frightened woman who had stepped down from a stagecoach in Promise Creek 10 days ago. Something inside her had been melted by the storm and the firelight and the slow accumulation of small kindnesses. "Cass," she said, "you can call me Della." He looked down at her. His weathered face softened. "Della," he said. He spoke her name as though it were a prayer he had been waiting all his life to say out loud. The next morning, Della walked out to the horse barn alone. Cass was inside, brushing down the big bay gelding, Thunder. He looked up when she stepped through the wide, open door. He saw her face. He saw the small wooden box clutched against her chest. He set down the curry comb. He waited. "Cass," she said, "I have to tell you something. I should have told you the first night. I was afraid. I am still afraid, but I cannot carry it alone any longer." He crossed the barn in 3 long strides. He took the small wooden box gently from her hands and set it on top of a hay bale. Then he took both of her hands in his huge ones and held them against his chest. "Della, whatever you are about to tell me, it does not change anything. You came into my house. I gave you my word. A Hollander keeps his word." She told him. She told him about her father, Edmund Marchwood. She told him about the false shipping documents in the rigged trial and the cup of broth in a prison cell. She told him about Wren, the small boy with honey-colored hair, who was the only family she had left in the world. She told him about Sister Hesper in the convent cellar and the matrimonial advertisement in the Boston newspaper. She told him about the leather notebook hidden inside the wooden box on the hay bale, the notebook that contained enough evidence to destroy the man who had murdered her father. And finally, with her voice shaking, she told him about the letter that had arrived a week ago, the 60 days, the threat to Wren, the name, Ambrose Thackeray. Cass had been standing very still while she spoke, his big hands warm around her small cold ones. But when she said the name Ambrose Thackeray, every muscle in his body went rigid. His face drained of color beneath the tan. His grip on her hands tightened until it almost hurt. He let go of her and turned slowly toward the open barn door and stared out at the snow-covered valley as though he had been struck by something invisible. For almost a full minute he did not speak. Then he turned back to her. His whiskey-colored eyes had gone hard and very dark. "Della, do you know why my father killed himself?" She shook her head. "He was a good man, my father. He was the best cattleman in this part of the territory. In the summer of '72, he partnered with another man to drive 800 head of cattle from this valley down to the railhead at Cheyenne. He had borrowed against the ranch to buy half the herd. The drive was successful. The cattle reached Cheyenne. They were sold for top dollar. My father came home with nothing. The other man had taken every penny of the proceeds and disappeared. My father could not pay the loan. He could not pay the men who had ridden with him. He spent the next 4 years trying to keep this ranch from collapsing. When my mother died in '75, something inside him died with her. He held on for 3 more months. And then one morning before any of us were awake, he walked out to that horse barn and ended it." Cass paused. His voice when he continued was almost a whisper. "The man who stole my father's cattle drive and put him in his grave was a Boston gentleman, a man with silver hair and pale blue eyes and the soft hands of a man who had never done a day of honest work. His name, Della. His name was Ambrose Thackeray." The barn went very still. Della felt the world tilt around her for the second time in 2 weeks. She put one hand against the rough wooden post of the stall to steady herself. She tried to speak and could not. Cass took 2 steps toward her and pulled her into his arms. She broke against his chest. She wept the way a person weeps when they have been carrying something alone for too long and suddenly find a place to set it down. He held her with his huge arms wrapped around her small frame, his face pressed into her honey blonde hair, and he whispered words she could barely hear. "You are home now, Della. You are home. He cannot take you from me. He took my father. He took yours. He will not take you. On this mountain, no one stands alone. I swear it. I swear it on my mother's grave. I swear it on every breath I have left. When she could finally speak, her voice was very small. Cass, what do we do? He held her at arm's length and looked down into her tear-streaked face. We end him, he said quietly. We end Ambrose Thackeray. Together. Once and for all. That night, the four of them sat around the long oak table after supper, and Cass laid out everything Della had told him. Lyndon listened with his soft brown eyes growing wider and wider. Rourke listened with his jaw tightening until the muscles stood out like ropes along the side of his face. When Cass had finished, there was a long silence. Then Rourke stood up. He walked to the window. He stared out into the moonlit snow for a long moment. When he turned back, his whiskey-colored eyes were burning. I am riding to Helena, he said. Tomorrow at first light, I am going to find Marshal Thaddeus Whitlock. He owes me a favor from 4 years ago. He is a federal man. He has the authority to open a federal investigation into Thackeray. And once a federal investigation is opened, all of Thackeray's bought judges in Boston will not be able to protect him. Cass nodded slowly. Lyndon cleared his throat. Everyone looked at him. He was the youngest. He almost never spoke up at family councils. I will go down to Promise Creek tomorrow, Lyndon said quietly, and I will keep watch. If any stranger comes asking questions about a young woman from Boston, I want to be the first to know. I will tell Maud Ainsworth at the dry goods store. She has eyes in the back of her head, and she does not like men in black hats. Cass smiled at his youngest brother. There was pride in the smile. And me, said Della softly. What do I do? Cass took her small hand across the table. You stay here. You stay where I can keep you safe. We have weeks before Thackeray can move against us. We will be ready for him when he comes. Della nodded, but inside she was thinking of Wren. Wren, who was 5 years old. Wren, who was somewhere in Boston in the hands of a smiling shadow in fine clothes. Wren, who did not have weeks. She did not say it out loud. Not that night. She squeezed Cass's hand and let the men plan their war. 3 days later, Lyndon came riding hard up the valley road in the late afternoon. His face was white. He swung down off his horse before it had fully stopped and ran into the house. Cass, there is a man in town. He came in on this morning's stage. He is staying at Stone's Inn. He is wearing a black bowler hat and a city suit, and he is asking everybody in Promise Creek about a young woman from Boston with honey blonde hair. Maud said he showed her a small photograph. She said it was a photograph of Della. Della felt her knees give out. Cass caught her elbow. What did Maud tell him? Cass asked. She told him she had never seen the woman in the photograph, and she was very sorry. She is a good liar, Cass, the best in Promise Creek. Cass stood very still for a moment thinking. I am going down to Stone's Inn tomorrow morning, he said. I am going to look this man in the eye and find out exactly who he is and exactly who sent him. Della shook her head. No, Cass. We are going down to Stone's Inn together. He is here for me. I will not hide behind you while you face him alone. Cass started to argue. Then he looked at her face. He saw the steel that had risen up beneath the soft blue of her eyes. He nodded once, together then. Rourke had ridden out for Helena 2 days earlier. It was just Cass and Lyndon and Della who rode down the mountain road into Promise Creek the next morning. Lyndon waited outside the inn with the horses. Cass and Della walked into the small lobby of Stone's Inn, and there at a corner table near the cold fireplace sat a man in a black suit reading a newspaper with a cup of coffee at his elbow. He looked up. He was perhaps 50 years old, iron gray hair, a face that had once been sharp but had been worn down by too many sad cases and too many disappointments. His eyes were the eyes of a man who had seen too much and forgiven himself for none of it. He set down the newspaper carefully. He stood up. Miss Marchwood, he said. His voice was quiet and tired. My name is Bartholomew Crane. I am a detective with the Pinkerton Agency. I was hired by Mr. Ambrose Thackeray of Boston to locate you and report your whereabouts. I have located you, but I have not yet reported. Della stared at him. Cass moved one half step closer to her, his hand resting lightly near the revolver at his hip. "Why have you not reported?" Della asked. The detective was silent for a long moment. Then he gestured to the chairs across from him. "Please, sit down. There is a great deal you need to know about the man who hired me. And there is one thing I need you to know about myself before we go any further. 3 years ago, I lost my own son to a man very much like Ambrose Thackeray, a wealthy man in Philadelphia who used the law like a club and the courts like a private hunting ground. I swore on my son's grave that I would never again help a man like that take what did not belong to him. I have been investigating Mr. Thackeray for the past 4 months on his own coin without his knowledge. I have a satchel upstairs in my room, Miss Marchwood. It contains documents, bribery records, witness statements, photographs of payments being made to a Boston judge named Pemberton. I have come west not to bring you back to Boston, but to put what I have into the hands of someone who can use it." He paused. His tired eyes searched her face. "I came west to help you destroy him." Della sat down very slowly in the chair across from Bartholomew Crane. Cass remained standing behind her, his huge hand resting on the back of her chair like a promise. Outside the window of Stone's Inn, the autumn light was beginning to fade across the rooftops of Promise Creek, and somewhere far above the town in the high country of the Bitterroot Mountains, the second snow of the Montana winter was beginning to fall. She did not know it yet, but in 72 hours, a coach and four would come thundering up the mountain road, carrying the smiling shadow himself. Ambrose Thackeray would arrive in Promise Creek in a tailored Boston suit with 2 lawyers and 3 armed men, and a forged guardianship order signed by a bought judge. He would buy Sheriff Jephthah Coles for the price of a small ranch in Wyoming. He would stand on the front porch of the Hollander house and demand that Cass turn her over. And in the most terrible moment of her life so far, Della Marchwood would do the one thing nobody, not Cass, not Rourke, not Lyndon, not even Bartholomew Crane would expect her to do. She would step out of that house and go with him. But that is the story of what came next. For now, in the small lobby of Stone's Inn, Della Marchwood reached across the table and shook the hand of a tired old detective who had come halfway across the continent to help her. And behind her, the huge, gentle man who had once cut his own father down from a barn rafter laid his calloused hand on her shoulder, and the three of them sat together in the fading autumn light and began to plan a war against a smiling shadow from Boston. Outside, the snow began to fall in earnest. The wind began to rise. And somewhere in the darkness, gathering above the Bitterroot peaks, the future was already moving toward them on iron-rimmed wheels. The second snow of the Montana winter was falling in slow, heavy flakes when the coach and four came up the valley road 3 days later. Della saw it first from the kitchen window. She had been kneading bread dough on the long oak table, her sleeves rolled to her elbows, her honey blonde hair tied back with a strip of blue ribbon. The simple work of her hands had been the only thing keeping her mind from running in panicked circles for the past 72 hours. Cass had ridden out at dawn to check the high pasture fences. Lyndon was in the barn with a sick mare. Rourke was still away in Helena 3 days into his hard ride to find Marshal Thaddeus Whitlock. The bread dough had just begun to rise under her hands when she glanced up through the glass and saw the black shape moving along the snowy road below the ridge. It was a long carriage drawn by 4 matched bay horses. Behind it rode 3 men on horseback, their dark coats stark against the white. And riding ahead of all of them on a tall gray gelding was a man Della recognized even at that distance by the careful angle of his shoulders and the silver of his hair beneath the brim of his black hat. Ambrose Thackeray had come to the Hollander ranch. Della felt the world go very still around her. The bread dough was suddenly cold and foreign under her hands. She wiped her palms slowly on her apron. She walked to the front door of the Hollander house. She opened it. She stepped out onto the porch in her thin gray cotton dress and stood very still in the falling snow and watched the smiling shadow from Boston ride up the lane that Cassius Hollander had cleared with his own 2 hands 6 summers ago. Lyndon came running from the horse barn. He had seen them too. His soft brown eyes were wide. He stopped at the foot of the porch and looked up at her. Della, get inside. Get the rifle. She did not move. He cannot hurt me here, Lyndon, she said quietly. Not yet, not until he has tried his words first. Men like Ambrose Thackeray always try their words first. Go and find Cass. Ride hard. Tell him to come home now. Lyndon hesitated for one heartbeat. Then he turned and bolted for the barn. A moment later, she heard the drum of hooves as he tore away across the snow toward the high pasture. The carriage and its riders rolled to a stop in front of the house. Ambrose Thackeray dismounted from the gray gelding with the practiced ease of a man who had once been an excellent horseman in his younger days. He was 60 years old. He was elegantly dressed in a charcoal traveling coat with a black velvet collar. His silver hair was combed back from a high forehead. His pale blue eyes regarded Della from beneath neat silver eyebrows with the polite expression of a man calling on his favorite niece. Adelaide, my dear, he said. His voice was as soft as spring rain. You look thin. The mountain air does not agree with you. Della did not answer. The other riders were dismounting now. Two of them she did not recognize. They had the hard, flat eyes of men who had been paid to do things other men would not do. The third rider she knew immediately by the badge gleaming on his coat and the deep frown carved into his weathered face. Sheriff Jephthah Coles of Promise Creek. Cass had spoken of him with respect once. Cass had said he was a fair man and a friend of the Hollander family for 6 years. The fair man would not look Della in the eye. The two lawyers stepped out of the carriage carrying leather satchels. They smelled of expensive hair oil and Boston smoke. Thackeray climbed the porch steps slowly. He stopped 1 foot away from her. He looked down at her with those pale blue eyes. Did you receive my letter, child? I received it. And yet, here you stand, defying me, refusing to come home like a sensible girl. I confess I am disappointed. Where is Wren? Thackeray's polite mouth curved upward at one corner. Your brother is exactly where I told you he is. Safe. For the moment. Whether he stays safe depends entirely on the next 10 minutes of this conversation. The hoofbeats came down the valley before she could answer. Della turned. Cass was riding flat out across the snow on the big bay gelding, Thunder his coat flying out behind him, his rifle across the saddle in front of him. Lyndon rode behind him on the gray mare. They thundered into the yard and Cass swung down off Thunder before the horse had fully stopped. He walked up the porch steps without looking at Thackeray. He walked until he stood between Della and the smiling shadow from Boston. Get off my porch, Cass said. His voice was as quiet as snowfall and as cold as the steel of his rifle. Thackeray's polite smile did not waver. He inclined his head in a small mocking bow. You must be the famous Cassius Hollander. I have heard a great deal about you. Your father was a fine cattleman. A pity about the cattle drive of '72. A truly unfortunate business. Cass did not move, but every muscle in his huge frame went rigid as iron, and Della saw his right hand drift down toward the holster on his hip. Sheriff Coles climbed the porch steps quickly. He laid one hand on Cass's arm and one hand on the official-looking parchment he had pulled from his coat. Cass, easy, easy now, son. I have got papers here. I am sorry, I truly am, but I have got papers and they look legal, and I am bound by my oath to enforce them. The papers were a guardianship order from a Boston court. They had the seal of Judge Pemberton at the bottom. They named Adelaide Marchwood as a person of unsound mind, incapable of making her own legal decisions following the recent death of her father. They named Ambrose Thackeray as her sole legal guardian. They authorized any peace officer in any state or territory to assist Mr. Thackeray in returning his ward to his custody. Cass read them. His weathered face went very white. These are forgeries, he said. They are notarized, said the sheriff miserably. By a judge that Thackeray owns, said Della from behind Cass's broad back. Sheriff Coles, that judge has been on Ambrose Thackeray's payroll for 10 years. I have proof. I have proof in this house right now. Coles would not look at her. Cass turned his head slowly until his whiskey-colored eyes were fixed on the sheriff's face. Jephthah, how much? The sheriff looked at his boots. How much did he pay you, Jephthah? How much was a 6-year friendship worth to you? The sheriff's voice was a hoarse whisper. A ranch in Wyoming, Cass. He paid off all my debts and bought me a ranch in Wyoming. I have got a sick wife, Cass. I have got 2 daughters who deserve better than what I can give them in a sheriff's ailery in a played-out mountain town. I am sorry. God help me, I am sorry. Della saw something break in Cass's face that was worse than anger. It was the look of a man losing one more thing he had thought was solid. The 2 hard-eyed men were drawing their pistols now, slowly, casually, without quite pointing them yet. Lyndon, who had reached the porch a moment behind Cass, stepped up to his brother's side and chambered a round in his rifle with a small, sharp, metallic sound. The 2 lawyers stepped backward toward the carriage with their leather satchels clutched against their chests. Thackeray raised one elegant hand. Gentlemen, please. There is no need for violence. We are all civilized men here. Mr. Hollander, you have 10 seconds to turn my ward over to my custody, or Sheriff Coles will arrest you for obstruction of a lawful court order, and my men will use whatever force is necessary to take her from this porch. I would prefer that no one die today, but I have come too far to leave without her. Cass did not move. His huge, calloused hand had closed around the grip of his rifle. Lyndon was breathing fast and shallow beside him. Della could see the pulse beating in Cass's throat. She could see that he was prepared to die on this porch in the next 30 seconds. She could not let him. She could not let any of them. She stepped out from behind Cass. She walked the 2 paces that separated her from Ambrose Thackeray, and she stopped close enough that she could smell the bay rum on his cheeks and the expensive tobacco in his pockets. Mr. Thackeray, she said. Her voice was steady. It surprised even her. I will go with you. I will come back to Boston. I will not fight you. But I have 3 conditions, and you will agree to all 3 of them now in front of these witnesses, or you will have to drag me out of this house in chains, and you will have to do it over the bodies of 3 men, and the territorial press will hear about it before the sun goes down tomorrow. Thackeray's pale blue eyes flickered with interest. State your conditions, my dear. First, you will leave the Hollander family alone. You will not harm them. You will not threaten them. You will not return to this valley. Second, you will guarantee my brother Wren's safety, and you will allow me to see him within 48 hours of our arrival in Boston. Third, I will give you the leather notebook only after I have seen Wren with my own eyes and held him in my own arms. Thackeray considered her for a long moment. The polite smile crept back across his face. He inclined his head once. Agreed, my dear. You drive a remarkably hard bargain for a young woman of unsound mind. Sheriff Coles, kindly stand down. Gentlemen, holster your weapons. Miss Marchwood and I have an understanding. Cass turned on her then. His face was a wreckage of disbelief and pain. Della, no. She turned to him. She raised her small hand and laid it flat against the center of his chest over the steady hammer of his heart. She looked up into his whiskey-colored eyes, and she did not let her own eyes fill with the tears that were burning behind them. Cass, listen to me. I lost my father to this man. I cannot lose you. I cannot lose Lyndon. I cannot lose Rourke. You 4 are everything good that has happened to me in 2 years. You are the only home I have ever truly known. Let me do this. Let me protect you. You are home, Cass. And tonight I have to leave home in order to save it. Do you understand me? Do you understand what I am telling you? His face had gone very still. Something was passing between them in that moment that no one else on the porch could see. He understood. She saw it in his eyes. He understood that she was telling him she had a plan, that there was something she could not say out loud, that he was to trust her now more completely than he had ever trusted anyone in his life. He nodded. Once. Slowly. A Hollander keeps his word. Della Marchwood, he said quietly. and so does a Marchwood. I will see you again. I do not know how, but I will see you again. On this mountain no one stands alone. She rose up on her toes. She laid her cheek against the rough wool of his coat for one long heartbeat. She closed her eyes. She inhaled the smell of him, wood smoke and leather, and the cold, clean wind of the bitter roots, and she let it become a memory she could carry with her into the dark place she was about to enter. Then she stepped away. She walked down the porch steps. She walked past the two hard-eyed gunmen and the two Boston lawyers and the broken-faced sheriff. She climbed into the black carriage. Ambrose Thackeray climbed in after her and pulled the door shut. The driver flicked the reins. The four-matched bay horses leaned into their harness. The carriage rolled forward across the snow and out of the Hollander Valley, and Cassius Hollander stood on the front porch of the Hollander house and watched the woman he loved disappear into the white afternoon, and the only sound on the entire mountain was the sound of his own breathing. Lyndon touched his brother's arm. Cass did not move. Cass, there is a piece of paper in my pocket. She slipped it to me as she walked past me on the steps. She moved her hand along my coat. I felt it. I have not opened it. Cass turned slowly. His huge hand shook as he took the small, folded square of paper from his brother's coat pocket. He opened it. The handwriting was Della's, hurried and faint, written in pencil on the back of a torn page from a hymnal. Cass, the notebook in the box is a copy. The real one is hidden inside my mother's Bible in the bottom drawer of the chest in my room between pages 80 and 81 of the Book of Psalms. Take it to Marshal Whitlock and Helena. Find Rourke. He will be on his way back. Get to Corinne, Utah territory before the Boston train leaves. The road from Promise Creek through Bear River is the only road Thackeray can take. I will stall him. I will stall him as long as I can. I have begun to memorize the names of every man in his company. I will bring you more proof if I can. I love you, Cassius Hollander. I have loved you since the moment you said my name on that buckboard. Find me. Della. Cass read it twice. His eyes were wet. Then his weathered face hardened into the face of a man who had finally, after 6 long years of carrying everything alone, been given a fight he could win. Lyndon, he said, his voice was iron now. Saddle Thunder and the gray mare. We are riding to Helena tonight. Tonight, Cass. It is 280 miles through winter country. You will kill the horses. We will kill them if we have to. We will kill ourselves if we have to. We are riding tonight. He went up the stairs 3 at a time. He walked into the small room at the top of the stairs that had been his mother's sewing room. He opened the bottom drawer of the chest. He lifted out the worn black leather Bible that had belonged to a woman who had died 12 years ago in a brick townhouse on Beacon Hill. He opened it to the 80th page of the Book of Psalms. Tucked deep into the binding, hidden against the ancient gilt edge of the page, was a small leather notebook, no bigger than his hand. He held it up to the dying afternoon light. He turned to a page at random. His father's name was not on that page, but the names of 3 United States senators and 1 federal judge were along with sums of money that made his head swim. He closed the notebook. He tucked it into the inside breast pocket of his coat against his heart. He walked back down the stairs and out into the snow, and 20 minutes later, he and Lyndon were riding south through the falling night with the wind of the Bitterroots at their backs and a small leather notebook against one brother's heart, and a long-held silence finally broken in both of theirs. The ride to Helena took them 4 hard days. They changed horses twice at lonely way stations along the road. They slept in the saddle when they could not afford to stop. They ate hardtack and cold bacon and drank from icy creeks. On the second night, they crossed paths with Rourke, who was already riding back hard with the news that Marshal Whitlock had agreed to come and was already on the road behind him with 5 federal deputies. The 3 brothers turned their horses around without dismounting and rode together back toward the rendezvous. On the saddle blanket between them in the cold blue dawn of the 3rd morning, Cass told Rourke everything Della had revealed. Rourke listened in silence. When Cass had finished, Rourke pulled his horse up sharp. Cass, the man in Thackeray's company, the big one with the broken nose, the one who never speaks. I saw him in Promise Creek the morning Thackeray rode through. I would know that broken nose anywhere. His name is Silas Pike. He is the one who framed me for that bank job in '74. He is the one whose lying testimony almost put me on a gallows. I have been hunting that name for 4 years. Cass looked at his brother. The wind moved through the pines around them. Then we will hunt him together, brother. And when we put him in front of Marshall Whitlock, his testimony will not just save Della, it will clear your name forever. Rourke looked away. His sharp falcon eyes were wet, which was something Cass had not seen since his brother was a child. For the first time in 4 years, Cass, I feel like I am about to be a free man, Rourke said quietly. They rode on. That night, by a small fire under the cold stars, Lyndon sat across from Cass and spoke up in a voice that was firmer than either of his brothers had ever heard from him. Cass, when we get to Helena, let me speak to Marshall Whitlock first. I have read every law book Promise Creek has between its four walls. I know how to lay out a case. You are the strongest of us, but I am the one who knows the words. Trust me with this. Cass studied his youngest brother in the firelight for a long moment. He saw perhaps for the first time that the boy he had raised after their father's death was no longer a boy at all. The soft brown eyes had gone steady. The hands holding the tin coffee cup were still. All right, Lyndon, Cass said quietly. You speak first. I will stand behind you. Lyndon nodded. He did not smile. But something in his shoulders straightened in a way that made Rourke, watching from across the fire, feel a quiet ache of pride for the brother who had once been the small boy, crying for 2 days after their father's death. Marshall Thaddeus Whitlock was a tall man in his 50s, with a thick walrus mustache the color of iron, and the steady gray eyes of a man who had outlived 6 gunfights and forgiven none of them. He met the Hollander brothers at a way station called Twin Forks, halfway between Helena and the Utah Territory line. Bartholomew Crane, the tired Pinkerton detective from Promise Creek, was already with him. So was a satchel full of documents that Crane had been quietly collecting on Ambrose Thackeray for 4 months. In a one-room log cabin at Twin Forks with a single oil lamp burning between them on a rough wooden table, it was Lyndon who stepped forward first. He laid Della's leather notebook in front of Marshall Whitlock. He explained who she was. He explained who her father had been. He explained exactly who Ambrose Thackeray had killed in his time. He spoke for 20 minutes without notes, his voice steady and clear, laying out the evidence the way Della had once seen Boston lawyers lay out a case in her father's parlor. Cass stood behind him with his arms folded and watched his youngest brother become a man. Marshall Whitlock had turned the pages of the notebook slowly. His weathered face grew darker with each page. When he closed it at last, he laid both his calloused hands flat on the table. Boys, he said, I have been waiting 10 years for a piece of evidence like this. I have known about Ambrose Thackeray for 8 of them, and I have never been able to lay a finger on him. Not until tonight. And son, he said, looking up at Lyndon, you have a head for the law that would do credit to any judge in this territory. Remember that. Lyndon's face went red. He nodded. Marshall Whitlock stood up. He buckled on his gun belt. Saddle up. The Boston train leaves Corinne, Utah Territory in 50 hours. Thackeray's coach cannot make Corinne in less than 60 hours because of the grade through the Bear River Pass. We have just enough time to get there ahead of him and lay a trap. We ride in 15 minutes. Anyone who is not in the saddle stays behind. Nobody stayed behind. 3 Hollander brothers, 1 federal marshal, 5 federal deputies, 1 tired Pinkerton detective who had not slept properly in 3 years and was suddenly riding like a man who had finally found his second one. They rode south through Montana into Idaho, into the corner of Utah Territory, where the Union Pacific Railroad ended and the long road from the north terminated. They rode through snow and wind, and one bright cold morning of brilliant sunshine, when the whole world seemed to be holding its breath. They changed horses 3 times. They ate in the saddle. They slept 4 hours a night. On the morning of the second day, they reached the Bear River Stage Station. The Bear River Stage Station was a long, low building of gray stone with a wide front porch and a big stable yard behind it. It sat at the bottom of the long downhill grade out of the Bear River Pass, which was the last pass before the open run down to Corinne and the railhead. Any coach traveling from northern Montana to the Union Pacific had to stop at Bear River to change horses and water its passengers. Marshal Whitlock had calculated that Thackeray's heavy carriage would arrive at Bear River in approximately 4 hours. He arranged his men with the patience of a hunter setting a snare. 2 deputies in the loft of the stable, 2 more in the storeroom behind the kitchen, 1 in the woods on the slope above the road. Bartholomew Crane in the parlor of the station with a cup of coffee, a newspaper, and a small derringer in his coat pocket. Cass Rourke Linden and Marshal Whitlock himself in a private dining room at the back of the station with the door open just enough to see out into the main room. They waited. The afternoon sun crept across the dusty plank floor of the station. A cat slept on the windowsill. A clock somewhere ticked. Cass stared at the door of the main room and tried not to think about what Della had been forced to endure for the past 5 days in the company of the smiling shadow. He did not have to think about it long. The carriage rolled into the yard at 3:30. Cass heard the iron rims of the wheels on the frozen ground. He heard the harness jingle and the horses blowing. He heard the carriage door open and the boots of 2 armed men hit the dirt. He heard a soft, polite voice that he had heard only once in his life and would have known anywhere. "Stretch your legs, my dear. We have an hour here. The horses must be changed." The door of the main room opened. Della Marchwood walked in first. She was thinner than she had been when Cass had last seen her on his front porch. There were dark hollows beneath her cornflower blue eyes. Her honey blonde hair had been pinned up in a severe Boston style she would not have chosen for herself. She wore a heavy black traveling cloak. She walked with her chin lifted and her shoulders straight, the way a queen walks toward her own execution. Behind her came Ambrose Thackeray, removing his black gloves 1 finger at a time. Behind him came Silas Pike, with his broken nose and his hand resting near his pistol. Behind Pike came the other gunman, whose name Cass did not know. Behind them came the 2 Boston lawyers, looking exhausted and irritable. They all moved into the main room of the station and stood blinking in the sudden warmth. Bartholomew Crane lowered his newspaper. Della saw him first. Her eyes widened a fraction of an inch. She did not betray the recognition with anything more than that. Marshal Thaddeus Whitlock stepped out of the private dining room with his federal badge gleaming on his coat and his Colt revolver leveled at the chest of Ambrose Thackeray. "Ambrose Thackeray," Marshal Whitlock said. His voice filled the small room like the toll of a great bell. "By the authority of the United States government, you are under arrest for the murder by poison of Edmund Marchwood, for the falsification of federal shipping documents, for bribery of a sitting judge of the Massachusetts Superior Court, for conspiracy to defraud the citizens of the state of Massachusetts, and for the kidnapping and false imprisonment of 1 minor child by the name of Wren Marchwood. Drop your weapons and place your hands above your heads." For half a heartbeat, the room was perfectly silent. Then Silas Pike went for his pistol. He never cleared the holster. Rourke Hollander stepped through the dining room doorway, and his right hand moved with the grace of a striking hawk, and his Colt was out, and his bullet had taken Silas Pike's pistol cleanly out of his hand before Pike's fingers had finished closing on the grip. The pistol clattered to the floor of the Bear River Stage Station. Pike stood gaping at his own empty, bleeding fingers, as though they belonged to someone else. The other gunman raised his hands very slowly. The 2 Boston lawyers fainted in unison against the wall like 2 well-dressed dominoes. Cassius Hollander walked across the main room of the station. He did not look at Ambrose Thackeray. He walked past Thackeray. He walked straight to Della. She was already moving toward him, and they met in the middle of the room, and his huge arms came around her and lifted her completely off the floor, and she buried her face against the rough wool of his coat and breathed him in for the first time in 6 days, and the 4 federal deputies, emerging from the loft and the storeroom and the woods, all paused and looked away, because the moment did not belong to them. He set her gently back on her feet. "You are home now, Della Marchwood," he whispered into her hair. "I am home," she whispered back. "I am finally truly home." Sheriff Jephthah Coles, who had been waiting outside in the carriage with the driver because Thackeray did not trust him to stay out of his way, was arrested in the stable yard 10 minutes later when he came inside to find out what the commotion was about. Coles did not resist. He held out his wrist to be cuffed, and he wept silently into his beard while Marshal Whitlock read him his charges. Silas Pike, with one bandaged hand and the other in cuffs, was loaded into a separate carriage for transport to Helena. He was already before the carriage even left the Bear River station asking Marshal Whitlock what kind of deal he could make in exchange for his testimony. Marshal Whitlock told him exactly what kind of deal he could make. By the time the carriage rolled out, Silas Pike had agreed to testify against Ambrose Thackeray on every charge. He had also agreed to sign a sworn statement clearing one Rourke Hollander of any and all involvement in the bank robbery in Bannock City in 1874. Rourke Hollander, who had carried that lie around his neck for 4 years, walked out into the cold evening air of the Bear River station yard and stood for a long time looking up at the first stars of the Utah night, and his sharp falcon eyes were wet again, and this time he did not bother trying to hide it. Della unfolded the small piece of paper she had been keeping hidden inside the lining of her bodice for the past 3 days. She handed it to Marshal Whitlock. "These are the names of every man in Boston Mr. Thackeray has paid since the autumn of '76. I copied them from his personal ledger when he was sleeping at the Three Forks Way Station. There are 2 more United States senators on this list whose names did not appear in my father's notebook." Marshal Whitlock looked down at the names. He looked back up at Della with something close to awe in his weathered face. "Miss Marchwood," he said quietly, "I have been a federal marshal for 27 years. I have known some hard men and some brave men, but I have never met a braver soul than you. Your father would be very proud of you tonight." Della could not speak. She turned her face into the rough wool of Cass's coat and wept openly for her father in a way she had not been able to weep since the day they had buried him in the small cemetery on Boston's North End. The federal trial was held in Helena 3 weeks later. It lasted 5 days. Marshal Whitlock presented the leather notebook of Edmund Marchwood. Bartholomew Crane presented his own 4 months of independent investigation, including bank receipts and witness statements and sworn affidavits from 3 former employees of Ambrose Thackeray's Boston import firm. Silas Pike took the stand and testified for 6 hours. Della Marchwood took the stand and told the story of her father, her brother, and the leather notebook in a voice so steady and so terrible in its quiet truthfulness that the judge had to call a recess twice to allow the spectators to compose themselves. Ambrose Thackeray was sentenced to life imprisonment in the federal penitentiary at Leavenworth, Kansas, with no possibility of parole. His Boston judge, Pemberton, was arrested within the week and sentenced to 25 years. Sheriff Jephthah Coles received 7 years for accepting bribes and for conspiracy to commit kidnapping. Silas Pike, in exchange for his testimony, received 15 years and the assurance that he would be kept in protective custody from the men whose names he had named. The 2 Boston lawyers were disbarred and given 5 years apiece. A federal court order was issued the day after Thackeray's sentencing to remove Wren Marchwood from the orphanage in Philadelphia where he had been deposited by Thackeray. Bartholomew Crane himself rode east on the next train. 11 days later, he stepped off the westbound train in Helena, holding the hand of a small, thin boy with honey-colored hair and large, frightened eyes, and Della Marchwood knelt down on the wooden platform of the Helena depot and opened her arms, and the small boy stared at her for one disbelieving second, and then he ran into her arms and buried his face in her neck and made a sound that was half a sob and half a laugh, and entirely the sound of a small soul finding its way home. She held him for a very long time. Cass stood a few paces back with his hat in his hands and watched the reunion he had ridden 1,000 miles to make happen, and he did not bother to wipe the tears from his weathered face. When Della finally rose, holding Wren on her hip, she walked over to Cass and looked up at him with her cornflower blue eyes shining. Cass, this is Wren. Wren, this is Cassius Hollander. He is the man who saved us. Wren stared up at the huge stranger in the long coat. He did not speak. He simply reached out one small hand and laid it gravely against the rough stubble of Cass's jaw. Cass closed his eyes. When he opened them, he said in a voice so soft only Della and Wren could hear, "Welcome home, Wren Marchwood. You are home now. On this mountain, no one stands alone." Wren did not understand the words, but he understood the tone. He laid his small head against Della's shoulder and sighed the long, deep sigh of a 5-year-old boy who had not slept properly in many weeks. The wedding took place on a meadow above the Hollander Valley on the second Saturday of May, 1879. Della had not wanted a church wedding in Promise Creek. She had wanted to be married on the mountain that had saved her. Cass had wanted whatever Della wanted. So they cleared a small, flat space on the south slope of the valley where the wildflowers grew thickest in the spring and the Bitterroot Peaks rose in the distance like a row of cathedrals, and they invited the entire town of Promise Creek to join them. Almost everyone came. Maud Ainsworth from the dry goods store, who had lied to Bartholomew Crane and become Della's first friend in Promise Creek. Bartholomew Crane himself, who had been hired by the Helena office of the Pinkerton Agency on Marshall Whitlock's strong recommendation. Marshall Thaddeus Whitlock, who had become a regular visitor to the Hollander Ranch and was rapidly becoming family. Sister Hesper had not come from Boston, but she had sent a small embroidered handkerchief, with a single forget-me-not stitched into one corner, and Della carried it tucked into her sleeve all day. Lyndon Hollander led the bride down the grassy aisle. Wren Marchwood walked in front of her in a small new suit, scattering blue lupine and red Indian paintbrush from a small willow basket. Rourke stood beside Cass as best man, his sharp falcon eyes suspiciously bright. The minister from Promise Creek, an old circuit rider named Reverend Peabody, performed the ceremony. When Cass spoke his vows, he did not use the standard words. "Della Marchwood," he said, "you came to my mountain as a stranger. You became the light of my house. I'm not a man of many words. I am not a clever man. I have only these 2 hands and this mountain and one promise to give you. You will never be afraid again. You will never stand alone again. You will always be loved by me, by my brothers, by this family, by everyone who lives on this land, until my last breath. On this mountain, no one stands alone. And tonight, Della, you have truly come home." Della spoke her own vows through tears she did not try to hide. She promised to love him for as long as the Bitterroot Peaks stood above the valley. She promised to teach his children to read. She promised to plant a garden every spring and sing in his kitchen every winter. She promised to remember Edmund Marchwood and Mary Hollander and to teach the next generation of children the names of the people who had died so that they could live. They exchanged the simple gold rings that Cass had ordered from a silversmith in Helena. The minister pronounced them husband and wife. Cass leaned down. He cupped Della's face with his huge calloused hands, as gently as if she were made of spun glass. He kissed her once slowly with the entire town of Promise Creek and 3 Hollander brothers and one small boy named Wren. Watching, and the wind moved softly through the wildflowers, and somewhere down in the valley a meadowlark sang. Their wedding night was their own. The door of the Hollander house closed behind them as the last of the wedding guests rode away down the valley road in the evening light. Outside, the first stars of a Montana spring night came out one by one above the dark walls of the Bitterroot Mountains. When the morning came, the second chapter of their lives had begun. The seasons turned. The years turned with them. Their first summer together, Della and Cass planted a garden twice the size of the old one. Lyndon taught Wren to read by the fire on winter evenings. Rourke bought 20 more head of cattle and began rebuilding the Hollander herd toward what it had been before his father's death. Their first autumn, Della discovered she was carrying a child. She told Cass on a cold October morning while he was repairing a fence post in the lower pasture. He sat down very suddenly in the wet grass and put his face in his hands and made a sound she had never heard from him before, a sound that was half a sob and half a prayer of thanksgiving. She knelt beside him and laughed and cried at the same time. Their first winter as husband and wife was a quiet one. The blizzards came, but they came kindly that year. On a bright morning in late February of 1880, Della gave birth to a healthy baby boy in the upstairs bedroom of the cabin with Cass holding her hand the whole time, and Lyndon boiling water downstairs, and Rourke pacing the front porch like a man waiting for news from a battlefield. They named the child Edmund Hollander after the grandfather he would never meet. Cass took the small, wrinkled red baby in his huge calloused hands as though he were holding the entire world. He whispered, "Welcome home, Edmund Hollander. Welcome home." The next spring, Rourke met Cordelia Ainsworth at the Promise Creek Harvest Festival. Cordelia was Maud Ainsworth's daughter. She was 24 years old. She could ride a horse better than most men in the territory, and she could shoot the head off a rattlesnake at 30 paces. Rourke fell in love with her over a single afternoon of pie tasting and target shooting. They were married 8 months later in the same meadow above the valley where Cass had married Della. They built a smaller cabin a half-mile down the creek from the main ranch house. They had 2 children of their own within the next 4 years, a girl named Mary after Cass's mother and a boy named Henry after Marshall Thaddeus Whitlock. Lyndon Hollander left the ranch in the autumn of 1880 to study law at the new Territorial College in Helena. Cass paid his tuition out of the federal restitution that the courts had awarded the Hollander family from the seized assets of Ambrose Thackeray. Lyndon completed his studies in 3.5 years. He returned to Promise Creek and opened the first law office the town had ever had. He took on as many cases for free as he did for pay, and he made a particular specialty of defending the rights of widows and orphans against any man who reminded him of Ambrose Thackeray. He married a Helena schoolteacher named Winifred Hayes in 1884. They never had children of their own. They had instead a great many nieces and nephews who all called Lyndon Uncle Lenny and pestered him for stories every time they came to visit. Wren Marchwood grew up at the Hollander Ranch as one of the family. Cass and Della never legally adopted him because legally he was already Della's brother, but everyone in Promise Creek called him Wren Hollander, and that was the name he eventually took for himself when he was 16 years old. He grew up tall and quiet with his sister's blue eyes and a careful, gentle way of moving among horses that reminded Cass painfully of his own dead father. Wren worked the ranch beside his brother-in-law for 10 years before going east to study architecture at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology, paid for entirely by Cass and Della. He became an architect. He designed houses across the Mountain West for the next 40 years. Judge Horace Pemberton, the bought magistrate from Boston, died of a stroke in his 4th year at the federal prison. Ambrose Thackeray did not die quickly. He lived 9 more years inside the gray stone walls of Leavenworth. He was found in his cell on a hot August morning in 1887 with a sharpened spoon driven into his throat by a fellow inmate whom he had insulted at supper the night before. His body was buried in an unmarked grave in the prisoner's cemetery. No one in the Hollander Valley ever spoke his name again. Marshall Thaddeus Whitlock died peacefully in his bed in Helena in the spring of 1895 at the age of 70. His funeral was attended by every Hollander then living. Cass spoke at the graveside. The years rolled on. The valley stayed. By the autumn of 1915, the old log house at the heart of the Hollander Valley had grown a new wing and a wide-screen porch. The ranch had grown to 1,500 head of cattle. There was a telephone in the kitchen now, though the line went out every time it stormed. There was an automobile parked in the shed where the buckboard wagon used to stand, though Cass refused to ride in it and still preferred his horse Thunder, who was now a very old horse indeed, and spent most of his days dozing in the lower pasture. Cassius Hollander was 67 years old. His chestnut hair had gone white as a snowfield. His huge calloused hands had grown a little slower, but no less sure. The small white scar through his left eyebrow was still there, faded now to almost nothing. He still rose every morning before dawn to feed the horses, although his wife had begun gently suggesting that he might let one of the grandsons do it. Adelaide Hollander was 59 years old. Her honey blonde hair was streaked with silver. The cornflower blue eyes were still bright. The small cameo brooch she had worn on the day she stepped down from the stagecoach in Promise Creek 37 years before still hung at her throat. She still made bread on the long oak table in the kitchen on Sunday mornings, and the smell of it still drifted through the windows and brought the grandchildren running. There were many grandchildren now. Edmund Hollander had married a Bozeman girl in 1902 and given Cass and Della 4 grandchildren. Lily Hollander, born in 1881 with her mother's blue eyes, had married a Helena lawyer who had once been a clerk in her Uncle Lyndon's law office. They had 3 children. Henry Hollander, born in 1887, had become a doctor in Missoula, where he had 2 children of his own. Wren Hollander had married a quiet woman named Adeline who liked to paint mountains. They had 3 children, all of whom called Della grandmother because Della was the only mother Wren had ever truly known. Rourke and Cordelia had 4 grandchildren. Lyndon and Winifred had a small army of beloved nieces and nephews who treated their cabin as a second home. On a long golden afternoon in late September of 1915, the Hollander Valley was full of running children. There were 14 of them by Della's count, ranging in age from 4 years old to 19. They were chasing each other through the high meadow grass on the south slope of the valley, where the wildflowers grew thickest, the same slope where Cass and Della had been married 37 years before. The blue lupine and the red Indian paintbrush were past their summer peak, but the goldenrod and the late asters were in full bloom, and the children moved through them like a flock of bright birds. Della and Cass sat in 2 old rocking chairs on the wide-screen porch and watched them. Rourke Hollander sat at the far end of the porch in his own rocking chair, smoking a meerschaum pipe. He was 64 years old now, and the wildness had gone out of him long ago, but his sharp falcon eyes still missed nothing. Cordelia sat beside him, knitting a small woolen cap for the newest Griffith grandchild who had been born only 3 months before in Missoula. Lyndon and Winifred had driven up from town that morning in Lyndon's Model T. They were sitting on the porch swing at the other end, holding hands the way they had held hands for 31 years. Wren Hollander, 42 years old now, was out in the meadow with the children, lifting the smallest of his nephews onto his shoulders and pretending to be a horse. The afternoon sun had begun its long, slow slide toward the western shoulder of the Bitterroot Peaks. Della reached over and took Cass's huge old hand in her own small, wrinkled one. She held it the way she had held it the night of the great storm 37 years before, when he had told her about cutting his father down from the rafters of the horse barn, and she had knelt on the wooden floor of the Hollander house and pressed his hand against her cheek, and known even then that she was going to love him for the rest of her life. "Cass," she said quietly, "do you remember the day I stepped down from that stagecoach in Promise Creek?" Cass turned his weathered face toward her. He smiled. The smile was older now, the lines around it deeper, but it was the same smile she had first seen by firelight in the cabin all those years ago. "I remember it like it was this morning, Della. You were the most frightened thing I had ever seen, and the most beautiful. I thought my heart was going to come right out of my chest when you put your little hand into mine." "Do you know what I was thinking when I first saw you?" she said. He shook his head. "I was thinking, this is the man who is going to save me, or the man who is going to break me, or perhaps both. I was so afraid I could not even speak. And then you reached up your hand to help me down from that wagon, and you said, 'You are home now, Della.' And in that moment I knew that I had truly come home, for the first time in my entire life." Cass squeezed her hand. His old eyes were wet at the corners, the way they had been on the night of the great storm. 37 years, Della Hollander," he said softly. 37 winters on this mountain. Do you have any regrets at all?" Della looked out over the valley. She watched her grandchildren chase each other through the wildflowers in the long golden light. She watched her brother Wren, all grown up now, swinging her newest great nephew through the air. She watched Rourke pull on his pipe, and Lyndon squeezed Winifred's hand on the porch swing. She turned back to Cass. She lifted his huge old hand to her lips and kissed his weathered knuckles. "Not one," she said. "Not a single one. Winter always ends, Cassius Hollander, and every single spring we have been given together has been a miracle I never dared to dream of. We built this with our own hands. You and me and your brothers. We built it out of nothing, and it is the most beautiful thing I have ever seen. The sun touched the top of the western Bitterroot Peaks. The light on the meadow turned from gold to amber to a deep, glowing rose. The shadows of the running children stretched long across the wildflowers. From the porch swing at the far end of the porch, Lyndon Hollander pulled an old silver harmonica out of the breast pocket of his coat. It was the same harmonica he had carried in his shirt pocket on the buckboard ride from Promise Creek 37 years ago. He had carried it with him every day of his life since. He raised it to his lips. He began to play. The notes of an old song drifted out across the screen porch and into the golden evening air. Shenandoah, the same tune he had played for Della on the second day of the great blizzard, when she had wept by the firelight for the mother who had once sung this same song to her in a brick townhouse on Beacon Hill. Della closed her eyes. The music wrapped around her, the way it had wrapped around her in the cabin all those years ago, and she felt her mother near her, and her father Edmund Marchwood near her, and Mary Hollander and her husband somewhere near her too, and all the small kindnesses of all the small days that had built this single perfect evening on this single perfect mountain. She opened her eyes. The grandchildren were still running through the wildflowers. Wren was laughing somewhere in the distance. Cass was still holding her hand. She thought very clearly, this is the day my life began. She had thought it once before on the morning after the great storm, standing on the front porch of the Hollander house with a wool blanket around her shoulders and a quiet, huge man at her side. She had thought it again on her wedding day in the meadow on the south slope. She had thought it the morning Edmund was born, and the morning Wren first called her sister again after their long separation, and 100 other mornings since. Each time she thought it, she had been right. Each day had been the first day of the rest of her life. She still remembered stepping down from that stagecoach in Promise Creek into nothing. 40 miles, a folded letter, a carpet bag, a small leather notebook hidden in the bottom of the bag, a heart so full of fear that she had not been able to speak. 40 years later, sitting on the porch of the Hollander house her husband had built, with his own two hands, watching her grandchildren run through the wild flowers of the valley with the Bitterroot Mountains burning gold and rose behind them, and her brother-in-law's harmonica playing the song her mother had once sung to her, Della Hollander, understood at last that all of it had been worth it. All of the fear and all of the cold and all of the long miles and all of the smiling shadows and fine clothes. All of it had brought her here to this porch on this mountain with this man beside this family. The harmonica played on. The wildflowers swayed in the soft evening wind. The children laughed and called to each other in the meadow. Cass squeezed her hand and she squeezed his back, and the sun slipped slowly down behind the dark blue silhouette of the Bitterroot Mountains, and the first star of the Montana evening came out high in the western sky. And on the wide-screen porch of the Hollander house, no one stood alone, and no one ever would again. Winter always ends, and a Hollander, Della Hollander, knew now, better than anyone, always, always, always keeps her word.